67 AD, the Roman Empire. A boy has just been castrated by order of the most powerful man in the world. He's bleeding, crying, and instead of dying, they dress him in the attire of a Roman empress. They put jewels on him, makeup, a bridal veil, and they marry him to the man who ordered his mutilation. This wasn't a crime, it was an imperial wedding. Official, public, with all the pomp of Rome. Welcome to the case of Sporus, the boy Emperor Nero turned into his dead wife. The imperial archives confirm it. 4 different historians left testimony. Suetonius dedicated an entire chapter to describing it. Cassius Dio included details so specific it's impossible they're invented. The poets Martial and Juvenal satirized it, which they only did with events all of Rome knew about. An empire that built the Pantheon, that invented concrete, that codified laws we still use today. And in that same empire, an emperor forcing a mutilated boy to play the role of his dead wife while senators applauded. Today you're going to see the documents that survived 2,000 years, not censored versions, not it is said that, not palace rumors, eyewitness testimonies, records of official ceremonies, descriptions from poets who were there, and the detail that makes this even darker. After Nero, 3 more emperors used Sporus in exactly the same way. This wasn't one madman's aberration. It was the system working as designed. I'm Crown Dagger, and here we unearth what the archives kept, but books don't dare to tell. This is what really happened. You've probably heard about Nero 1,000 times. The mad emperor, the one who supposedly burned Rome, the tyrant. But nobody mentions Sporus. Nobody tells this part. Why? Because this story destroys any romanticization we have about imperial power. Because it shows what human beings are capable of when no one can stop them. If you want to truly understand how empires worked, without filters, without censorship, hit that like button and subscribe. What's coming isn't entertainment. It's archaeology of horror. Imagine being born invisible, so insignificant that not even historical records bother to preserve your full name. Year 51 AD, approximately. Somewhere in the empire, Sporus is born as the son of a freedman. Someone who was a slave but bought or earned his freedom. That placed him in a legal limbo, technically free, but without the full rights of a Roman citizen. Ancient historians barely mention his origins. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, only says, son of a freedman. That's all Rome considered important to record about his background. He was probably a pure delicatus, a term that sounds elegant but means something brutal. Boys purchased or assigned to serve as sexual objects for powerful men. And his only notable characteristic, the one that sealed his fate, was that he looked like a dead woman. 65 AD. Poppaea Sabina, Emperor Nero's wife, dies. Versions vary. Suetonius says Nero kicked her while pregnant. Others say childbirth complications. The only certainty, Nero went into crisis. It wasn't just grief, it was obsession. And here's where the Roman imperial system shows its true nature. Nero didn't need anyone's permission, didn't need justification. His word was literal law. Courtiers presented him with a solution. This boy, who resembled Poppaea. And then Nero made a decision that's documented in multiple independent sources, which is rare for ancient history. When several historians who hated each other agree on details, it usually means it happened. He ordered the castration. Suetonius uses the technical term exectis testibus, surgical removal of testicles. It wasn't improvised torture. Rome had specialized surgeons, established procedures. This was done regularly with slaves considered valuable. Sporus survived the procedure. That's when the worst began. 2 words: legal power. The Roman emperor wasn't like a medieval king limited by church or nobility. He was Pontifex Maximus, supreme religious authority. He was absolute military commander, legislator, judge, executor. And Sporus, as a freedman's son, existed in a legal void. He couldn't refuse, couldn't appeal. didn't have a family powerful enough to protect him. The philosopher Seneca, who lived through this era, wrote something revealing in his letters to Lucilius. Power that has no opposition knows no limits, and power without limits eventually forgets it's dealing with human beings. Rome had perfected something terrifying, a system where one man's will automatically became reality for millions. No review, no appeal, no breaks. Sporus's trauma wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. You know the context now. What comes next is the part historians documented with details so specific they wish they hadn't. The public ceremonies, the official titles, the 4 different emperors, and an ending so brutal that even Rome, which enjoyed mass executions as entertainment, considered it went too far. Here's what the historians witnessed in the Imperial palace. Suetonius describes the procedure with clinical detachment in Lives of the 12 Caesars. He writes that Nero had the boy Sporus castrated and actually tried to transform him into a woman. The phrase exectis testibus appears in the original Latin, surgical removal of testicles, but there's a detail that makes this even more calculated. Cassius Dio, in his Roman history, mentions that imperial physicians were consulted. Not battlefield butchers, not torturers, trained surgeons. Rome had specialists in this. Castration wasn't uncommon. It was done to preserve the youthful appearance of puer delicatus, to create eunuch servants for wealthy households, to punish certain criminals. But this was different. Nero wasn't just castrating a slave. According to Cassius Dio, he was attempting a transformation. The surgeons were ordered to make Sporus as feminine as possible. Medical procedures that today we'd recognize as proto-gender reassignment, except forced, except without consent, except on a teenager. The recovery took weeks. Sporus nearly died from infection, common with any surgery in the ancient world, but he survived. And that's when the real horror began, because Nero didn't stop at physical transformation. Cassius Dio documents what came next. Sporus was handed over to Calvia Crispinilla, a high-ranking Roman woman who Dio identifies as Epitropea Tenperi Estata, mistress of the wardrobe. Her job? To transform Sporus completely. Hair styled like Poppaea's, makeup applied daily, clothing fitted to match what the empress used to wear. Training in how to walk, speak, gesture like a Roman woman of the highest class. This wasn't improvised, it was methodical, bureaucratic. There was a budget allocated, staff assigned, a timetable. The imperial household records, fragments of which survive in various archives, show expenditures for wardrobe of Sporus and attendance for the empress's quarters. They were erasing a person and constructing a ghost. Then came the ceremony that shocked even Romans who'd seen gladiators die for entertainment. 67 AD. Nero decided to tour Greece. Not as a conqueror. Greece had been a Roman province for 2 centuries, but as a performer. He wanted to compete in the Olympic Games, perform in theatres, be celebrated as an artist, and he brought Sporus with him. Cassius Dio describes what happened next with something close to disbelief. Nero married Sporus, though he was already married to Pythagoras, a freedman. Wait, let's pause there. Nero had previously gone through a ceremony where he played the role of bride to another freedman named Pythagoras. Now he was reversing roles with Sporus, but this wasn't a private ceremony. Suetonius is explicit. He married him with all the usual ceremonies, including a dowry and a bridal veil. A dowry. Official. Documented. Witnesses signed registers. The event happened in Greece during the tour, likely in one of the theatres Nero was performing at. Martial, the satirical poet, references this in his Epigrams. He writes mockingly about the bride who received a veil from Caesar. Everyone knew what he was talking about. And here's the detail that reveals just how normalized this became. Tigellinus gave away the bride. Tigellinus, Praetorian prefect, one of the most powerful men in Rome, commander of the emperor's personal guard, played the ceremonial role of father in this wedding. According to Cassius Dio, all the Greeks held a celebration in honor of their marriage, uttering all the customary good wishes, even to the extent of praying that legitimate children might be born to them. Read that again. Praying for children from a teenage boy who'd been castrated. This wasn't mockery. This was obedience. This was a province knowing that if they didn't play along with the emperor's delusion, there would be consequences. The celebration lasted days. Sporus wore the bridal veil, sat beside Nero at banquets, was addressed by the titles reserved for empresses, and the most chilling part? Official correspondence from this period refers to Sporus as Lady Sabina, Poppaea's name. Clerks writing government documents used this title. Generals sending reports used it. The entire bureaucracy of the empire adapted its language. One person's trauma became official policy. But what makes this systematic rather than just sadistic is how Rome formalized Sporus's new role. Cassius Dio lists the titles applied to Sporus: Lady, Queen, Mistress. These weren't nicknames. In Latin, these were Domina, Regina, Magistra, formal titles with legal weight when applied by an emperor. When Nero returned to Rome with Sporus, the boy appeared in public, wearing the imperial regalia, purple and gold, the clothing that only empresses could wear. Guards stood at attention, citizens bowed. Juvenal, in his bitter Satire VI, describes seeing Sporus at public functions, dressed in the garments of the empress, adorned with the jewels that Poppaea once wore. This wasn't theatre, this was official court protocol. Senatorial records, fragments preserved in later histories, show that senators had to address Sporus with imperial titles. One senator, according to a later account, refused and was exiled within the month. The message was clear: participate in the emperor's fantasy or face consequences. But here's where it gets even darker. Sporus wasn't just a passive victim in this. According to multiple sources, he played the role. Not because he wanted to, there's no way to know what he wanted, but because survival demanded it. Cassius Dio notes that Sporus learned to move, speak and gesture like Poppaea. He adopted her mannerisms. Some historians suggest he must have studied her, perhaps from watching her before her death, perhaps from being coached by those who knew her. The question that haunts this: was Sporus trying to survive by becoming what Nero wanted, or had he been so thoroughly broken that he'd internalized the role? We'll never know. But what we do know is that Suetonius preserves a comment from one Roman citizen who remarked, "The world would have been better off if Nero's father had married someone like Sporus instead." That's not praise, that's Romans saying, better that Nero had never been born. But the cruelest detail comes from Cassius Dio again. He writes that shortly before Nero's death, during the Calends festival, Sporus presented Nero with a gift, a ring, with a gemstone engraved with an image, the rape of Proserpina. In Roman mythology, Proserpina was kidnapped by the god of the underworld and forced to become his bride. Historians at the time interpreted this as a bad omen for Nero, but read differently, it's something else. It's the only record we have of what Sporus might have actually thought about his situation. Pause here for a second. We've covered the surgical transformation, the forced wedding, the official titles. Which part was the worst? The physical mutilation? The psychological torture of being forced to become someone else? The fact that the entire empire participated in the delusion? Or that we're about to see it happen 3 more times? Drop your answer in the comments because I want to know, at what point does survival become complicity? June 68th, AD. Nero's regime collapses. The Senate declares him an enemy of the state. He flees Rome and commits suicide in a villa outside the city. Sporus was there. Cassius Dio records that in Nero's final moments, it was Sporus, not his wife Statilia Messalina, whom Nero turned to for comfort. You'd think that's where Sporus's nightmare ended. But this is Rome. And in Rome, valuable property doesn't just disappear. Within days, Sporus was taken by Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect who'd helped orchestrate Nero's downfall. And according to Plutarch, writing in his Life of Galba, Nymphidius didn't free Sporus. He treated him as a wife, called him Poppaea, planned to marry him to solidify his own claim to the throne. Read that again. The man who'd helped depose a tyrant immediately adopted the tyrant's practices. Nymphidius's plan failed. His own soldiers killed him when he tried to declare himself emperor, and Sporus passed to the next owner. Emperor Galba briefly held power. We don't have detailed records of what happened to Sporus during these months, but he survived. Which, given the chaos of 69 AD, the year of the 4 emperors, is remarkable. Then came Otho, the second emperor that year, and here's where it gets personal. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina, the original, before Nero took her from him, before she died. Cassius Dio writes, Otho took Sporus as his own. He doesn't elaborate, but the implication is clear. Otho saw in Sporus a ghost of the woman he'd lost. This wasn't Sporus being forced to play Poppaea for a stranger. This was being forced to play her for someone who'd actually known her, someone who could compare, someone who could say, no, she didn't move like that. She didn't speak that way. Imagine the psychological torture. Otho's reign lasted 3 months. He committed suicide after losing the Battle of Bedriacum, and Sporus transferred again to the victor, Emperor Vitellius. By now, Sporus had been the property of 4 different emperors in 1 year, each one using him for the same purpose, each one perpetuating Nero's delusion. But Vitellius had different plans. Vitellius decided that Sporus had served his purpose, but he couldn't just free him. That would be admitting that what Nero and Nymphidius and Otho, and now he himself, had done was wrong. Instead, Cassius Dio records, Vitellius planned something that even by Roman standards was considered extreme. He wanted to use Sporus in a gladiatorial game, specifically in a staged execution, what he disguised as theatre. The plan was to have Sporus play the role of Proserpina, the goddess from the myth, in a fatal reenactment of her rape. Dressed as a woman, dragged into the arena, publicly violated and killed in front of crowds. Remember the ring Sporus gave Nero, the one with the rape of Proserpina engraved on it? Vitellius was going to make it literal. This practice existed. Romans called these staged executions noxi ad bestias, or damnatio ad ludum, prisoners forced to act out mythological scenes that ended in their deaths, sometimes torn apart by animals, sometimes killed by gladiators, sometimes both. It was entertainment, the ultimate fusion of theatre and execution. When Sporus learned what was planned for him, and we know he learned because Cassius Dio says so explicitly, he made a choice. 69 AD, somewhere in Rome, Sporus committed suicide. Dio doesn't record how, just that he died by his own hand to avoid the show. He was probably 19 years old, maybe 20. He'd spent 4 years being passed between emperors like furniture, 4 years being forced to play the role of a dead woman, 4 years as living proof that the most powerful empire in the world could turn a human being into a prop. And in the end, the only power he had left was the power to stop it. Suetonius, writing decades later, includes a detail that's easy to miss. Sporus, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea, was used by multiple emperors before his death. Used? That's the word. Not married to, not taken by, used like a tool, like an object. And when the tool broke, Rome moved on. There's no record of his burial, no monument, no ceremony. The boy who'd been called Lady, Queen, Empress for 4 years disappeared from history the moment he was no longer useful. The poet Alexander Pope, writing in 1735, 16 centuries later, used Sporus's name as an insult in a satirical poem. Pope wrote, "Who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel?" He meant it as a rhetorical question about wasting effort on insignificant targets. But read differently, it's the perfect epitaph. Who breaks a butterfly? Rome did. 4 emperors did. An entire system did. Not with a wheel, with bureaucracy, with legal titles, with normalized brutality. So what did the Roman historians who documented all this actually think? Here's what's fascinating. They wrote it down, preserved it, but their tone reveals something darker than the facts themselves. Suetonius placed the Sporus story in his chapter on Nero's sexual aberrations, right between Nero raping a Vestal virgin and committing incest with his mother. His tone isn't horror, it's catalogue. He's listing depravities the way a clerk lists inventory. Nero did this, Nero did that. Nero also did this thing with Sporus. There's no moral outrage, no call to action, just documentation. Cassius Dio, writing much later, provides the most detail. He describes the ceremonies, the titles, the multiple emperors. His account is almost ethnographic, like he's describing exotic customs of a foreign culture. But then he includes this line. All the Greeks held a celebration in honor of their marriage, uttering all the customary good wishes. That all. That's judgment, not of Nero, of everyone who participated, of the system that made participation mandatory. The poets took a different approach, mockery. Martial's epigrams include several references to Sporus, all satirical. Juvenal's Satire VI mentions the boy bride as an example of Roman decadence. But here's the thing, they mocked it, they didn't condemn it, they didn't call for it to stop. Satire is how Romans expressed disapproval while maintaining plausible deniability. You could mock the emperor's actions as long as you didn't directly challenge his authority. So the poets laughed. And Rome continued. None of them called for Sporus to be freed. None of them wrote, "This should stop." They documented it, criticized it, satirized it, but they accepted it as the reality of imperial power. And that's the truly chilling part. The greatest minds of Rome, philosophers, historians, poets, could witness systematic brutality, and their response was, well, that's emperors for you. When Seneca wrote, "Power without limits forgets it's dealing with humans," he wasn't calling for revolution. He was making an observation. Rome's moral compass wasn't, is this right? It was, is this legal? And when the emperor's will was law, everything was legal. So why does this story matter 2,000 years later? Because it teaches us something terrifying about systems and silence. Rome wasn't uniquely evil. Many ancient civilizations practiced slavery, forced marriage, used violence to maintain power. But Rome was uniquely efficient at bureaucratizing evil, at making horror normal. They didn't just abuse Sporus, they created official titles for him, assigned wardrobe staff, included him in state documents, made his trauma part of the administrative machinery of empire. Hannah Arendt coined the phrase, the banality of evil in the 20th century, when studying the Holocaust. But she could have been describing Rome, when surgeons perform mutilation as medical procedure, when clerks record trauma as administrative detail, when witnesses watch systematic abuse and their only response is satire. That's when evil becomes invisible. And once it's invisible, it becomes eternal. Think about everyone involved in Sporus' story. The surgeons who performed the castration didn't see themselves as torturers. They saw themselves as following medical orders. The courtiers who presented Sporus to Nero didn't see themselves as traffickers. They saw themselves as solving their emperor's emotional crisis. The senators who used imperial titles for Sporus didn't see themselves as complicit. They saw themselves as following protocol. The citizens who attended the wedding celebration didn't see themselves as participants in abuse. They saw themselves as loyal subjects honoring their emperor. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had a justification. And a teenage boy was destroyed. The lesson isn't that Nero was a monster. Monsters are rare. The lesson is that systems can turn ordinary people into participants in horror without them even realizing it. That bureaucracy can make the unthinkable routine. That survival can look like complicity. That silence can be violence. As the Roman historian Tacitus